Welcome to our third talk on My Masterpiece, My Family, where we're going over the Holy Father Pope Francis's catechesis precisely on the family that he's been giving us ever since last spring, all the way up through the World Conference of Families that we had in Philadelphia recently. And we've already spoken a little bit about the different kinds of relationships there are. For example, last week we spoke about the relationships between parents and children, between children and parents, siblings among themselves, parents or children and grandparents, and so on. One thing we haven't really focused on too much is the relationship between husband and wife in marriage. And we spoke in the first session about the fact that, well, what is the foundation of the family anyway? It's the fact that we have a father and a mother, which obviously come from the fact that there's a husband and a wife. So today what we're going to focus on is, what is the church's vision? Which is another way of saying, what is God's vision for marriage? And if we look at the Bible actually has quite a lot to tell us. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, following Pope John Paul II's lead in this regard, because John Paul II is really perhaps the figure who has most spoken about God's plan for marriage using different biblical texts. The Holy Father takes us from the book of Genesis, right in the very beginning creation, where we see God's original plan for marriage. And we see it in that famous couple that we know, Adam and Eve. If you recall, how did God create Adam and Eve? It doesn't say that God just created one and then he created the other one. If we go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says the following. God created Adam, it says God created man. In his own image and likeness he created him. And then it says, male and female, he created them. So, for God, he looks at humanity and he says, we are a unity, but we are a unity that is distinct between male and female. And the idea being that both men and women, male and female, we are intercomplementary. We need each other. Each one of us has gifts to contribute to the other that the other one simply doesn't have. And if you think about it, what is it that God is doing with us? He's not creating us where one is better. He's not creating a circumstance where one is supposed to be in charge of the other, one is supposed to be even an oppressor of the other. He's not even putting us in conflict with each other where he's saying, let's see who's going to win. The idea is that each one contributes. If you look at the terminology used in Genesis, actually, for example, in the creation of woman, what does it say? It says God made a helpmate for Adam. Now the word helpmate, again, it doesn't just mean a sidekick or an assistant. The word used in Hebrew denotes somebody who has the same mission. So God created Adam and Eve with the same mission, and each one of them is going to work together on this same project as a couple. That's God's plan for marriage. A couple who love each other, who work together to create something beautiful. And what they create is ultimately, it's going to be an image of God himself, an image of God's Trinity, God who is Father and Son, and from the union of that Father and Son, it proceeds the Holy Spirit. Well, what happened in Genesis? We know from chapter 2 the tragic consequences when Adam and Eve first listened to Satan. They committed the first sin. They took the fruit, the forbidden fruit, off of the tree, and what happened? Immediately, the first result, Adam and Eve start fighting. And ever since then, husbands and wives have been suffering this consequence. Ever since the first fall, husbands and wives have been fighting. Well, where do those fights come from? Those fights come from when we look at each other and we no longer trust. When we look at each other and we see somebody, maybe an instrument to be used. When we look at each other and we no longer see somebody who I'm going to give myself to, but maybe somebody that I can start to take something from. So, the results of original sin were mistrust, dominion, and lust. Those are the fundamental consequences that Adam and Eve's marriage suffered. But even then, even when we had committed that big mistake, God didn't give up on his plan. He didn't give up on marriage. You see, he created, in biblical terminology, it says, he made them skins, he made them covering, clothing. What's he doing? He says, okay, the original plan has been wrecked, but I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to protect it. I'm going to give them what they need so that from their messed up situation, so to speak, they can continue walking down a path and start arriving bit by bit to the plan that I've always had for them. See, God never gives up on his plan for us, no matter how well or how poorly we choose to respond to it. And marriage is always going to be something central to God's plan. And if we think about it, how does Jesus begin his public ministry? Where does his first miracle take place? It's at a wedding. It's at Cana. Jesus' whole ministry, the symbol for it, the image, is a wedding. And that's where he begins his great work. Jesus comes from a family and he begins his miracles in a wedding. That's not an accident. God doesn't just do those things. God does that for a reason. So, what are some of the obstacles that we face in our marriages then? I think, and again, I have to be honest here, I'm copying the Pope. I didn't come up with this stuff. But what the Holy Father, Pope Francis, says is stuff that we deal with all the time. Especially as priests, it's something we hear one way or another every day. The first big fear, or first big difficulty we face in marriage, why is it, for example, that so many people don't even get married? Why is it that in our parish, unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are beautiful people, maybe even beautiful couple, who maybe even have beautiful children, and they're not married? Well, what happens? Sometimes it might be an economic thing, but you want to know the real roots? It's twofold. Number one, we live in a culture that is, to use the Holy Father's word, provisional. What's that mean? It means short-term, passing. It means we were looking for quick fixes because we never know how long something is going to last. We never want to be tied down to things. We never want to get locked into a commitment. We want to have something that we want as long as we want it, and the minute we don't want it, we can walk away. And so many problems happen with our families. So many problems happen in relationships when we approach our relationships as men and women, husbands and wives, well, even boyfriend and girlfriend, whatever, with a provisional mentality. Because what happens when we do have children? And all of a sudden, one of us decides, you know what? I no longer want this relationship. Do we just walk off? Well, sadly, a lot of times we do. And what happens? Left behind, there are children who suffer the consequences of maybe not having their father or their mother in their life, who have all of the baggage of wondering a little bit, why did they leave? Related to that is another elemental fear. What is it that you think causes this fear of commitment? Well, I think fundamentally it has to do with fear of failure. When we trust in ourselves, when we consider that this is going to come down to me, that's where the root of the problem is. God never told Adam and Eve, you know what? I want you two to get into a relationship where you're going to live all of your lives together and it's up to you to make it work. God never said that. See, the way God made us is he wants to be the glue. He wants to be the thing that keeps us united. He wants to be the thing, he's not necessarily so that we never have a fight, but he wants to be the force, the point of union that allows us, even when we do have difficulties, even when we do have misunderstandings, even when we've got conflicts, that's part of life. And God allows that. And there's a reason he allows it, because when we are able and willing to overcome difficulties for each other, that's when our love truly grows. And that's when we become more like God. So God wants to be the thing that makes our marriages work. And the reason why so many people are so afraid of getting tied down to a lifelong commitment, it's that. Because if we don't have God in the equation in the first place, Well, of course we're going to think, how is it possible that I'm going to live an entire life with this person? What if I get tired of this person? What if things just don't work out? What if I find somebody who's more attractive or that I would maybe be happier with? If God isn't going to be the person, the force that's going to make that union work, of course we're going to feel those temptations. And we might even be half right. But the thing is, God is eternal. God is all-powerful. And God can take us when we freely unite ourselves in that bond that we call holy matrimony, the sacrament of marriage. See, what are we doing is we're asking God to give us the grace and the strength we need to make it work. Even if we have our individual problems, even if we have our deficiencies and our weaknesses and everything, even if we might still have things that make us fight. You see, with the grace of God, we can find ways to make it work. And even those things that cause friction between us, those can become sources of greater love, because it requires greater love to overcome difficulties than just to stroll through as if everything is a walk in the park. And so, really, that is going to be my invitation. If you are a couple who's living together and maybe you are not married yet, really take a look into getting married. Take a look, at least talk to the priest. See if this is something that we're serious enough about. Because if we try to live a family life, we try to live a marriage without that grace of God's sacrament, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult. How much more beautiful it's going to be if we have God giving us the means and the support and the grace that we need to make it through the hard times. And if we are married, does that mean things are not going to be difficult? Of course not. You know, I'm going to give a couple of tips that I give to basically all the young people that I know when they're in serious relationships and when they're thinking about getting married, and even when they are married. Is it just two basic things that I think are critical to any Catholic family working. The first one is this. It's real simple. You've all heard the expression, the family that prays together stays together. You have no idea how true that is. You know, I heard a statistic a number of years ago. I think the statistics are a little bit old, but fundamentally it's going to still be relevant. I believe it was Matthew Kelly who gave this stat. And he said, in the United States, basically at the time, probably about 10 years ago, out of every 2 marriages, 1 of them ends in divorce. Okay? You figure roughly that statistic will still be valid. Among families, and he doesn't state what the religion is, he doesn't state what he means by this yet. He says, among families that pray together every night, whatever that means, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes reading the Bible, praying the rosary, whatever their prayer is, it is 1 out of 2,000. So let's repeat that again. Out of the typical American family, 1 out of 2 is ending in divorce. Out of families that pray together every day, the statistic was 1 out of 2,000. So, you can draw your own conclusions from there. But at the root is this. The family was meant for God. The family is meant to be what the church calls a domestic church, a little church, the church of the home. It's meant to be a place where God is the glue that unites us and helps us to fall more in love. And secondly is going to be this. Husbands and wives, and maybe even children too, in a different way, we need to find ways to communicate. I went to a marriage a marriage renewal weekend once with a particular group in the Philippines. Very good group, very good weekend. I learned a bit there. But fundamentally, the whole weekend came down to this. We need to learn how to, first of all, identify what are the things that my spouse does that gives rise to strong emotions in me. Call them by name, write them down. And then write it on the list. And then simply each one of you has your list. You get together and you talk about it. And without accusing, without saying, you always do this, or assigning motivations or motives, you do this because of whatever reason. No, because you don't know the motives. You might think you do, but you probably don't. You probably have it at least partially wrong. Simply to say, when this happened, this is how I felt, and vice versa. And to begin that process of regular communication. What happens when we open up ourselves regularly? We make ourselves vulnerable. And when we make ourselves vulnerable to the other, we make ourselves lovable. We make ourselves capable of opening, of loving the other person, and we open up a space in our heart so that God can be the one to fill it. So let's continue working on our marriages. Let's continue praying for each other. Let's continue praying with each other. Continue praying with our families. Let's continue making our homes places where we really speak together, where there's dialogue, where there's listening, where there's time spent together. And in that way, God will truly be alive in our hearts. God will truly bless our families, and our households will become places where peace reigns and where charity is lived. God bless you all.